Greetings, hello, willkommen. So today we're going to be talking about postmodernism. So we will be doing this topic on account of my monthly Patreon draw, so congratulations to my patron, Chris. Chris, how does it feel to be a winner? Probably pretty good. So Chris has chosen this topic, won by a draw, and I will be doing it, so if you'd like to ever participate in a draw, to have me talk about some topic that you are interested in, of which I have some knowledge, then check out my Patreon page, the link will be below, and so let's dive right in. So in order to talk about postmodernism, we have to talk about the modern period, because as you can tell, post in postmodern is past or after modernism, after the modern period. So the modern period is commonly referred to really as it starts in the late 19th century. So it's when science is really starting to happen. However, the ideas, I would argue, and from a philosophical perspective, so from the perspective of the growth and development of philosophy, I'd say that the ideas underlying the modern period started long before the 19th century, more like the 16th century, much more like that time period. However, to be, abide by the Google criteria, we will say that it really started in the 19th century. So what was happening? Really, what's happening was, to start with, science. That is, the scientific methodology. That is, this idea that there's a world that we exist in, and within that world, there are truths. There are truths we can find, and the common truths we've been told, so religion, for example, is essentially dogma. It's speculation. It's not proving anything to us. We want to find a way to prove things to ourselves within, the world of what's given to us. So within this world, we think that there must be some absolute truth, and we wish to discern it by our scientific methodology, right? So it's really a period of a movement away from dogma and a movement toward trying to really evolve as a species, to understand things for ourselves and create the proper method which leads us to be able to understand things for ourselves. And so from these two things, we move into essentially a kind of universalism, right? This idea that from our scientific methods, from which we can discern absolute truth, we can sort of bring everything together into these universal theories. That is, we can discern what are the universals of our experience, right? So an example of a universal would be that, so there are three possible sexes human beings can be: a male, a female, or intersex. Right? So that's a universal, absolute sort of truth. And conversely, we also saw that realized in science at the time of, for example, Newton's theories of, cosmology. He had these ideas about absolute time, or absolute space, and that essentially that this is the sort of groundwork that from these universals, once we discern them, we can sort of construct these universally applicable theories based on these fundamental universal truths, or that because there are universal truths, we can, from them, construct our coherent systems, or a unified, universal system of how things work, right? So then that can be applied to human beings, obviously, to space and time, Newton, and to, broadly speaking, anything we could experience or scientifically scrutinize or evaluate could be brought into a universal scientific theory. So this brings us into determinism, right? The idea that, the best way I like to put it is, there is a quote by, it's funny to quote Hegel here, but a quote by Hegel, which is, nothing can come between the concept and its realization, between the implicitly determinate nature of the seed and the adaptation of its existence thereto, right? So the idea is that the seed contains with it, whatever a given seed, whatever it be, allegorically or literally, the seed contains what it will turn into, right? So in that way, a seed is deterministic. The seed it contains the sort of blueprint for the thing, given the right conditions, it will evolve into, right? And that sort of becomes one of the sort of defining features of all of these things tied in together. It's that from that starting point, right, from being able to discern the universal structure or some universal principle, we can then discern what that seed, what that universal eventually becomes. And what it becomes, bringing all of the things that exist, of what they become, those things can all be brought into one unified sort of system, right? So obviously another defining feature of that, which I've discussed in my Jordan Peterson video, is obviously rationality, right? The age of reason is really a really important point here. It's that through the use of reason, our innate capabilities, we can discern all of these things. So reason is highly prized in this period. So I think that's a general and accurate enough way or point at which to lead that. It's pretty broad, right? So then to move into postmodern, right? So this really, for me, from my understanding, hinges on essentially social construction, right? So it's a distrust of universalism and essentially, primarily, a distrust of determinism in all of its different forms, right? So it's saying that, you know what, things aren't as static, perhaps, as the modern view sort of paints the world. The world is a lot more plastic than that. So for example, to give you an idea of what that means. So from my perspective, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I would say that the postmodern period really started to kick off in the 1960s, to my understanding. And some of the texts that I would, academic texts that I'd probably attribute that to, or that just from which I see postmodernism really taking hold, would probably be the Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn, and The Archaeology of Knowledge by Foucault. So I think those texts are I think there's some contentious issues there, so I've read those, and for me, I feel like Foucault is copying Kuhn, just applying it in a different way. So let me tell you what I mean. So Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions is this idea that at any given time, we can't be fully sure that our scientific practices or our scientific methodologies and what they determine are absolutely accurate, right? Because at any given historical moment, we're limited by what we've up until then experienced and found out. And what's problematic about that is that when we look back throughout history, so let's think of, for example, Galileo. So Galileo observed that, it seems to be the case from my, scientific observations that the Earth is not the center of the universe. The Earth is not the center of the solar system, right? But he was forced by the church basically his option was either take that back or we're going to cut your head off. So as you can imagine, he took it back. But the point is that we have ideas that sort of we fully believe about the way things are, but over time, as we learn more, those ideas start to change, right? So Galileo, within that time period, so his view was an anomaly, right? It was something that didn't fit into the religious point of view of the way that things worked. It wasn't something that could be reconciled with the prevailing sort of theory, as much as you want to call humans sort of ideas about how things were at that time a theory. His point was, his existence was an anomaly. The points of what he had pointed out do not fit into the system. And so people, violently fought against him to take it back so we can preserve the system. So Kuhn's point is that essentially that the scientific enterprise really works in that way. That is, at any given historical moment, we construct the best theory based on modernism, trying to universify everything, trying to bring everything into a grand theory. Other people have tried to do that, obviously. Einstein, Hawking, trying to make it all coherent. But Kuhn says that at any given historical moment, we are doing that. We're trying to, whether it's all the way back in Galileo's time or whether it's now, we construct theories based on what we know. But the problem is that we don't really fully know everything, right? So within any given historical moment of a given theory, there are typically anomalies that come up, whether they're small or whether they're quite large. They build up until we sort of have a revolution, right? Sometimes the discovery of something that doesn't fit into the theory can lead to a fundamental changing of the theory, right? And that changes our view of reality. So in the case, going back to Galileo, so the view of the world with the Earth at the center of the universe is a radically different world than the view of Earth as the center of the solar system, which circulates the sun, which is in turn, circulating the Milky Way amongst a larger, emptiness of happenings that are all, other solar systems and stars and so on. That's a radically different world than those two things. They're irreconcilable. So Kuhn's largest point is that we essentially, I can't recall completely if he necessarily makes it into a cautionary tale, but his point, I guess, is that we should be aware that is a reoccurring theme with the development of our understanding in scientific practice, that anomalies accumulate, and that once they accumulate to the point that they can't be overlooked anymore, the system or the theory has to change to adapt it or to create a new theory. So in that way, it's very difficult whether to say that something is absolute or not, because we could be proven completely wrong down the road. So I think more or less Kuhn's sort of postmodern theory in that way is a recognition of this sort of I don't want to say transience, but the sort of just general, I'm struggling for the word, revolutions, I guess, that the historical enterprise is a series of revolutions, and that we shouldn't be so ignorant as to assume that we've reached the final revolution, right? Because to my knowledge, we're not quite there yet, and I think most scientists would probably agree with that as well. So then Foucault, for example, Foucault applied this more broadly, essentially to more of our social knowledge, not necessarily our scientific knowledge, but that our social ideas evolve in that way too. I think that the way that Foucault would put it, would be to take, for example, our continual understanding of mental illness, right, of mental health. So way back, when we look back, pre-modern period, people with mental illness were more or less like lepers in the community. They didn't really contribute, they were sort of laid about the streets, they're not very functional, not taken care of, more so left to their own. But then, as we progress more closer to the modern period, not quite there yet, we start to see governments enacting, having penitentiaries and lumping in criminals, vagabonds, the mentally ill, disturbed people, prostitutes, anybody they can find, just shove them into the penitentiary. Anybody who's not productive or useful to society, shove them in the penitentiary, lock them all up in there, and that's the sort of limit to our knowledge on that. But then as we move into the modern period, and as we start to have all these ideas about science and studying and discerning absolute truth and how things are determined and so on, well then now we start to have the mental asylum, right? The birth of the asylum. So we move our perception about people who are not quite mentally there from being that of a criminal that needs to be in a penitentiary to that one who needs to be sort of put up and put away in a mental asylum, but also more or less studied and attempted to be treated for their illness, usually by particularly violent and disgusting means. I mean, putting people in ice cold baths, electroshock therapy came later, chaining them up. I mean, the extent of the treatment to them to try and force them out of it was fairly brutal. But then again, as time continues, we eventually get rid of the asylum. We start to have psychologists, psychiatrists, these people that specialize in studying and discerning what mental illness is. And so all along that time period, right, all along the course of the development of the understanding of mental illness and the mind, we're having a change in our understanding about what mental illness really is, right? So the language, the dialogue is continually changing in terms of, it's changing because our understanding is changing. So in that way, there's a sort of, just like in the system of Kuhn, there's this sort of, these sort of anomalies build up, right? It's this idea that, at this historical point in time, well, we're not quite, it doesn't seem like this is quite right, or maybe we're not doing this to the best of our abilities. And so these anomalies in our understanding build up, and so we change. So we go from the penitentiary to the asylum. And then once we're in the asylum, well, we realize, holy shit, we're acting like animals. So again, we have the revolution, we change, we get rid of the asylum, we start to make it more, sort of formalized. We still have people in hospitals, we still have these psychiatric units, but we become more understanding of care. So these are a series of social revolutions in the changings of our understandings that trigger them. So in that way, so it's in that sort of sense, I think that the more reasonable postmodernists refer to social construction, right? Because those are all very obvious, intuitive things. Those, that's not difficult to understand, nor is it very debatable. It's just a sort of a historical matter of fact. So in that capacity, I think that variety of postmodernism is extremely reasonable. What's not reasonable about that? However, one of the things about that, though, so specifically coming from Foucault, is that Foucault puts a special kind of distrust into the authority figures of each of those given time periods, right? So he's skeptical of the people who operate the penitentiary, he's skeptical of the people who run the asylum, and in turn, today, as he was before he died, he's skeptical of those authority figures, those new psychologists and psychiatrists who claim to have all of this absolute knowledge about how things work. And so this sort of distrust of those figures leads into a larger sort of disdain for the enterprises of these disciplines which act on the world. So it's a distrust, becomes a distrust of psychology, becomes a distrust of science itself, or of the scientific method and their ability to discern things. Because it's sort of a distrust based on the recognition of the perceptual revolutions that sort of characterize human development in different ways. So is born the idea of social construction in that way. I think that's one manifestation of social construction. And so I think this leads us into new distinctions within postmodernism that we need to set out. So we have determinism, right? So that's pretty inherent to the modern period. It's the ideas of the seed, of the seed being implicitly determinate of what it will adapt to. And then we have social construction, which is sort of can be conceived of as an opposition to that the seed isn't necessarily determinate. In each of these things, we need to recognize that there's a strong version of determinism and there's a weak version of determinism. And in the same thing in social construction, there's a strong version of it and there's a weak version of it. So within determinism, right, so you could be a sort of modern type thinking person and believe that everything is determined by the seed. So all seeds necessarily contain precisely what the thing will be. Or there's also the weak version, which says things are semi-deterministic. Some things are completely determined, and in others there's room for social construction, or a sort of nature versus nurture, right? There's an interplay of nature versus nurture. So a manifestation of determinism would be to say that one's gender is entirely determined by one's sex, and by that I mean gender as stereotypical norms that sexes typically do. So a strong version of determinism would say that all sexes need to act, or ought to act, in line with what's natural for them, or with what their sex is. They need to perform the corresponding roles that are natural to them, right? It presupposes there is a natural to them. Whereas the weak version would say that yes, people are biologically determined by their sex in some capacity, but within that, not everyone is going to align with the sort of norms of their sex. People are individuals, so yes, they will have some universal features that are across the board the same, but there's room for variation there. So then when we move into social construction, it's the same idea. The strong version would take on the view that there's no determinism, that you'd have to suppose that things are given in the world, but within the way that things are given, at least in the human world, we socially construct them. So again, on sex and gender, it would render sex obviously biologically given, but it would say that gender, so the norms associated with sexes, those are completely performative. Those are entirely sort of socially enacted norms. They're not in any way related to one's sex. So just because females tend to manifest meekness, that tends to be a relatively, females tend to be very agreeable and men tend to be more assertive, they would say that that's a completely socially conditioned role. There is nothing inherent or natural or universal in the female, archetype or the female body, which necessitates that as being the way that things are. So there's nothing natural about the female being inherently more agreeable and the male being inherently more assertive. So they would deny, for example, that there's an evolutionary correlative between those things. They'd say no, it's just completely performative. That's it. But then there's a weak version of social construction as well, which would probably say, well, we are biological entities, and so a certain amount of us is determined. It's that if you're a female, as long as you develop normally, you're going to have a vagina, you're going to have breasts. If you're a man, you're going to have a penis. And that there are some behaviors that come from us, specifically from our sex, that are predetermined in some way. But there's room in there for us to move around. That there's also nurture, that we also play our role in constructing our behavior and reality. So there's more. So this is completely free will. This is a little bit of room for free will, a little bit of room for determinism. And I think that really these things are strongly correlated. So weak determinism is basically weak social construction. They interplay and mesh with each other. One is essentially the other, right? There are a sort of meeting of points and negotiation between what we socially construct and what's already just determined by the fact. But whereas these, however, are complete opposites. Strong determinism versus strong social construction are the antithesis of each other, right? So putting it in dialectical terms, one is the thesis and one is the antithesis, and I would argue that the synthesis of the two, so if we recall a dialectic, it's just essentially that a thesis meets an antithesis, so two opposing points meet, and from their interaction and interplay with each other, they give rise to a synthesis of more or less of the two, or something new that emerges from the two together. So I would argue that both views, the strong social construction, which would be a radical postmodernism, and the strong version of determinism, which would be a radical modernism, if you want to say that those are both wrong. Both of those things can be completely contradicted by each other. So I would argue that the necessary synthesis is where they're the same. It's the merging, and I think that that's supported, to my knowledge, in biology and neurobiology and the sort of all those areas of the hard sciences, which sort of prove that, for example, on the human level, so speaking about it in terms of us, we're the result of nature and nurture, right? So just because I'm a female, that may predispose me to behave and act in certain female ways, but there's no necessary causation that predetermines that I'm going to do that just because I'm a female. No, what a human is, regardless of sex, is nature, what they are, and then their interaction, their nurture with the environment, right? So for me, that I would say that view there is a postmodern view, because it's a recognition that all is not necessarily inherently deterministic. There's chance and there's chaos even in the universe itself and manifested in our reality. So for me, postmodernism is not this, like devil that it's being painted out to be. What's the devil? Are these radical positions that lead people to disgusting, despicable views. So someone who's a strong version of a determinist is one of those people who says, men have their roles, men ought to man up and do what's biologically deterministic of them. They are the sole providers, the rational, intelligent ones, whereas women are weak, ought to, like fucking MGTOW. Like, women deserve to stay in the home, they're worthless, fuck them all, like literally fuck them all. That's all they're worth, that's their biological function. So to me, you're an asshole and you're very ignorant. You should die. But the strong social constructivist version of that would be that no, there's no deterministic nature of the sexes whatsoever. It is purely, entirely socially constructed, as we said. And that leads to people to some radical shit as well, right? So we've got all of these strange genders emerging of, we are free to construct our gender identity completely, and there's no such thing as biological sex. It's just an assignment that's socially constructed at birth. That's the argument you hear those people make all the time, which is a doctor just slaps, the arbitrary authority of Foucault just slaps a gender on the baby, and it's just completely arbitrary. That's all there is. It's nothing. So I'm free now to be gender queer, I'm free now to be whatever the hell all those names are. And so ensues this. So as I said, both of these positions are irrational. You're not fully thinking, or you're not fully aware of the synthesis that needs to occur, and which our current paradigm, our current scientific paradigm currently supports, right? So I think that this is something that really needs some recognition right now as well in, popular culture, because all of these strong version social constructivists are really just, damaging postmodernism completely. They're just ruining it in the face for everyone by what they're doing and having postmodernism attributed to them. Because I think that's way too simplistic, and it's only talking about the strong version of social constructivism, right? And as I said, the same thing applies to those who fall in the strong version of determinism. So my conclusion is that postmodernism is not evil, it's that radical views are inherently misguided and ideologically motivated and driven. What needs to occur in such situations is the dialectical understanding of what's authentically true within it. It's that there is determinism, and there is room for the sort of social construction also of who we are, of our lives, of circumstance within it. It's like, just understanding that is, really fruitful and beneficial, and it would be great if people could just, stop having such radical views and, ruining everything, but I'm sure that's not going to happen anytime soon. So, thank you for being here. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you're not yet subscribed to me, pound that subscribe button. Okay? Bye.